Years and years and years before Peter Jackson ever embarked on this project, Tolkien said that he thought that The Lord of the Rings was a book which was highly unsuitable to the process of dramatization.
An unfilmable book. That's what Tolkien thought. He let the film rights go for nothing because he knew it could not be made into a film.
There's enormous amounts of material to cover, and actually it all seems to get more and more compressed. In fact, in The Return of the King, it does get more and more compressed, and material which would have taken, half a chapter earlier on now takes, a paragraph, and then you're moving on.
I mean, The Two Towers has a huge amount of story. The movie is obviously, 3 hours long, and there's no way that we could put all of The Two Towers into The Two Towers.
And the fact is that events which take place in the book called The Two Towers do not chronologically actually happen within that time frame. They actually take place running alongside or at the same time as events which take place in The Return of the King.
When Frodo is being carried away by the orcs after he's been wrapped up in the spiderweb by Shelob, at that exact moment in the book, if you really break the timelines down, you discover that Gandalf and Pippin are at Minas Tirith and the siege of Minas Tirith is underway.
So what Peter has done in the movie version is to iron out the timelines and bring all the action together chronologically.
I was concerned at the end of the second movie because I could see how much they'd got to do. Not only had they got to get in the whole of Volume 3, but there were something like 8 chapters out of Volume 2, which were still coming up.
You have all of the scenes with Frodo and Sam going past the fortress of Minas Morgul. They climb up the cliff, they arrive at Shelob's tunnel. Frodo has an encounter, Sam ultimately fights Shelob. Then the orcs carry Frodo's wrapped up body away. All of that was actually part of the Book of the Two Towers.
The remaining chapters that we took out of The Two Towers and stuck into The Return of the King, the film, were The Road to Isengard, Flotsam and Jetsam, The Voice of Sauron and The Palantir. We made the decision quite early on to strip those down, pass those down to their bare minimum of what we needed from them. So bits and pieces of them appear in different shapes and forms, such as the Palantir, which Pippin acquires, and you see them in the Death of Saruman scene.
I think if you see these movies now, you would understand why we did what we did. It seemed like a natural thing to do. It wasn't those big dilemmas. I mean, it was actually quite simple, and it happened at the beginning, and we never changed it, and I think it was the smartest thing to do.
They did such a great job of trimming, not necessarily the fat, but trimming those moments and those sequences from the book that didn't necessarily have a place in the story that they were trying to tell. And they did that so well without losing the essence of the story and losing the essence of the books.
As long as you're carrying the spirit of the book with you, I think you can do a lot of things differently.
One significant place where we did deviate very, very intentionally was that Frodo sends Sam away, when they're making their way towards Shelob's lair, and that the characters actually separate, which of course doesn't happen in the books.
We felt that we had a character who was actively trying to separate and disrupt the goal of our other two characters, that being Gollum, and he was never going to get a payoff. He never really succeeds. So we knew we wanted a scene where he successfully separated the two of them. I think more importantly than that, we knew we wanted Frodo to enter Shelob's tunnel alone.
Most must go inside the tunnel.
It's all about the tension, the current tension in the film, and it is more tense, the fact that Frodo goes in there alone. I think it's good that Frodo's not always right. He's not this angelic character, that he does not have complete faith in Sam.
The original version of that scene had Frodo pretty aggressive, borderline psychotic, sort of really saying, get out of here, you can't help me, in a really pretty venomous kind of tone.
I'm sorry, Sam. Go home!
What we were playing was really that Frodo was a junkie by this stage, that he was addicted to the ring.
And it was changed later as we had more time to think about it. We realized that was it was a little bit too intense for Frodo. They had me start doing additional dialogue recording, just kind of tone it down to sort of keep the intensity but not make it so, so evil. So I asked them if they had any other takes. I was like, did we ever do any versions that weren't nearly as intense? And I had. There were a couple in there that were a little bit calmer, certainly for the go home moment, instead of the
Go home!
It was more quiet and subdued.
Go home.
So ADR really became a great asset to us as we were able to kind of re-envision things and rethink things. You know, not only perfect upon performance, but really hone in on how we want a scene to carry itself out and ultimately what we want the themes of these scenes to be.
Hey, pages hot off the press.
As a fan of the books, you fall in love with certain passages, and then sometimes you hoard them, and then you try to make them work. And Fran came to me with this scene that she'd written with the lines from the book, which describe what Frodo sees when he passes over towards the Undying Lands.
And the ship went out into the high sea and passed on into the west, until at last, on a night of rain, Frodo smelled a sweet fragrance on the air, and heard the sound of singing that came over the water. And then it seemed to him that, as in his dream in the house of Bombadil, the grey rain curtain turned all to silver glass and was rolled back, and he beheld white shores, and beyond them a far green country under a swift sunrise.
That is the image that Tolkien has of the land the other side of death. That's what you're going to.
What the filmmakers did was to take the essence of that description and to give it to Gandalf in describing just such a scene to Pippin.
What? Gandalf? See what?
White shores. And beyond, a far green country and a swift sunrise.
Splendid words to say, and I suppose touching that Gandalf should choose to say them as words of comfort to a young man.
And Ian McKellen read it and knew exactly what to do with it immediately, and so did Billy.
You know, he'd have me in tears just telling me about this far green country, you know.
That isn't so bad.
No. No, it isn't.
The Mouth of Sauron as a sequence was not quite as powerful as it is in the book.
Because in the book it turns on the tension of whether Frodo is alive or not. And we as a reader don't know that, because the last time we heard from Frodo, we knew he had been captured by these really terrifying orcs.
Because the movie deviates from the book in this respect in terms of the chronology of how events are laid out, at this point, despite, you know, the Mouth of Sauron telling you, implying basically that Frodo is dead or worse, we all know he's not.
And in a way it makes the scene a bit redundant, because we're having Gandalf and the others reacting to the horror of the thought of Frodo's death.
Frodo.
And yet we, the audience, are sitting back thinking, well, he's not dead, he's alive. And so it takes a lot of the heat out of it. It's a good example of how our restructuring of the storytelling and the parallel storylines is was a disadvantage to us in this particular case.
And in the end, if a scene's giving you that much grief in the storytelling, you should probably get rid of it before you shoot it and find another way to do the storytelling. But I think everybody loved the concept of the Mouth of Sauron and that challenge and that showdown.
For me, I always loved that there was some physical representation of that evil, of Sauron, because the only version of Sauron that we've seen is in the prologue of Fellowship of the Ring.
Sauron's always proven difficult in these films, especially to me. I mean, I've always had problems with my sort of movie making hat on. I mean, it works fine in the book, no problem with the book, but your villain is basically a giant eyeball.
You've got in Sauron a disembodied representation of evil, a force, a presence, yes, but no physical manifestation.
We felt that we really had to do something more than just have Sauron staying in his tower as this flaming eye, that we had to have him make an appearance outside the Black Gates at the end of Return of the King. And we also felt that Aragorn has come this distance with his journey and that Sauron is his enemy, and that we had to somehow have this personal duel between Aragorn and Sauron. And that's not in the book, but we felt that it had to be in the movie.
The original thought was to have some sort of, angelic presence, which essentially was the devil in disguise. The moment where Aragorn is dismounted and they're all standing there vastly outnumbered, and this blinding bright light shines on us, which blinds, everyone except Aragorn at a certain moment sees something and walks toward it.
It was Anatar, which is the representation of Sauron as he is in his true angelic form, not in the destroyed sort of evil force that inhabits the rest of the film.
It was the form he took when he managed to fool the elves into actually creating the ring. And we thought that, okay, we've got Sauron confronted by this heir of Isildur. In a way, he's got to be feeling a bit nervous. He hasn't been able to find the ring, and he comes forward in this guise of seduction and beauty.
Then the angelic figure suddenly turns into Sauron and attacks Aragorn.
We played around with the idea that Sauron comes out and he's even bigger than he ever was before, but Pete kind of knew that those 14-foot monsters very, very, very rarely work.
We were trying to make Sauron look like he was way bigger than he really was. I mean, it was an actor in armour who was not much taller than Viggo.
And what we originally shot was, 3 days of fighting, this whole, knockdown drag-out with Sauron.
It was not what Tolkien imagined. And we realised that was actually totally demeaning to what Aragorn was doing. The story was so clear as to what was happening that this was all about Frodo and Sam. And Aragorn realises if they're still alive, then he has to do what he can to help Frodo and Sam. And so Aragorn's heroism is not a one-on-one duel with the big villain. His heroism is his attempt to put his own life and the life of his troops on the line in the vague hope and dream that it somehow may give Frodo and Sam that little opportunity to help them complete their mission. But we thought, well, we have to have Viggo doing some sort of a heroic fight, and we thought, what's a worthy foe for Aragorn if it's not going to be Sauron? And we thought, well, a troll, a big, mean, armoured troll, except we had not shot any footage of Viggo fighting a troll. But we had shot the Sauron fight, which we had long since discarded.
In the end, we used what we could, mostly on my side, and then added the troll.
And then when we decided to ditch the whole Sauron fight and to simply, make it more about buying time for Frodo, I thought that, well, all this bright light footage that we have of looking and reacting to the light, that there was no way we could use that. But then it was actually Viggo himself that said to me, well, we could use some of that footage if we had the idea that the eye flares out. It's almost like it's beaming in on Aragorn. It's psychically affecting him.
That worked for Pete, I think, because it intercut with what was going on with Sam and Frodo. Without having to cut over to them, you realize, so they shot, I think, then they shot that scene where you see the light leaving Sam and Frodo.
We sort of got the best of both worlds, because we had that moment where he's drawn away, and just when you think that he's somehow being affected by this force, he turns and he says,
"For Frodo."
And you realise that he's not affected by it at all, and it really worked quite well. And so some of that original Sauron the Fair footage actually made it into the film in a completely different context. The destruction of the ring was always one of those really problematical situations, a bit like whether Sauron appears at the end. It was basically the decision really had to be made is do you stick with the book, which has Gollum finally grabbing the ring once he's bitten Frodo's finger off. He stands on that rock and he is so overwhelmed with joy. He sort of dances. I think in the book he does a little sort of almost like it's described as a dance.
But Gollum, dancing like a mad thing, held aloft the ring. He stepped too far, toppled, wavered for a moment on the brink, and then with a shriek he fell.
Peter had this notion or this sense that he wanted Frodo not to be inactive, that we kind of invested all this energy and time with this character and then just have him be a bystander in that moment.
And so our first concept that we originally had in our screenplay was that Gollum has the ring, Frodo has his finger bitten off, Frodo jumps to his feet, and he comes and he pushes Gollum. He doesn't touch the ring, he pushes Gollum and the ring over. So Gollum and the ring fall, and Frodo kind of disappears and ends up hanging on the rock.
I know Fran and I had a few doubts about that. We were worried about how that was going to look. And then when Pete actually shot it, and he went for it, the very first time he shot it, it did feel as if Frodo was killing Sméagol and Gollum, as if it was an act of murder.
It's not quite fulfilling Tolkien's theme that it was sparing Gollum's life was what ultimately caused the ring to be destroyed.
That it was fate, in that moment, fate that tipped Gollum over the edge.
So we then decided at the very last minute, and it was really the very last minute because it was Andy Serkis's final day in New Zealand. It was Elijah's second to last day in New Zealand. We were about to lose these guys forever in terms of their involvement on the film, and we thought, you know what, we've got to squeeze in. It wasn't part of our schedule or our plan during pickups, but we thought we want one more go at this.
We wanted it to kind of appear somewhat ambiguous, so that Gollum would fall over more out of the struggle and accident than out of Frodo killing him.
You just go, ring, and then it becomes hands, and then it becomes like, you know, and it's like a push me, pull you, with the ring being the centre.
Yeah.
We wanted to make it look much more like Frodo's trying to get the ring back. It's not about killing Gollum. It's not about destroying the ring. It's about him taking the ring back.
Really the mirror image of the beginning, which is the two addicts slugging it out for the possession, and again it goes all back to the ring.
And we also knew that we needed Frodo to go over the edge. We needed for him to go. And the reason we wanted him to go over the edge is because we felt one of the most dramatic moments is not just the death of Gollum and then Sam saying, "Come on, Mr. Frodo, we've got to get out of here." It's got to be, "Don't you let go." And to make that a tough choice for Frodo, we needed to give him the other choice, which was to let go and end it all. And you can't do that by just having him stay there and not get up. You needed to have him dangling over the edge.
The lesson really in terms of the filmmaking from that is you don't stop making the movie. And we were just always rewriting scenes and writing new scenes and shooting stuff and tweaking the films and stuff. And constantly challenging ourselves really to try to think of last-minute improvements.
Hey, one more for luck. That was great, Sean. That was a good one. One more for luck. Quickly, we're still rolling.
The Scouring of the Shire is basically, 70 or 80 pages of story that happens after the ring is destroyed.
They arrive home and surprise you, not with a happy ending, but with the fact that, whilst they've been off saving the world, this evil has managed to infect their own home.
So they think they've won, and then they go back and they find their whole homeland has been almost destroyed.
And I think Tolkien perhaps makes the point that the Shire isn't invulnerable. It just thinks it is. But it too should actually bear some part of the pain and the casualties of Middle-earth.
And this is where the real nature of evil is genuinely brought home to the reader, because we never thought that the Shire could be spoiled.
We did pay homage to it in the Fellowship of the Ring. When Frodo looks into Galadriel's mirror, he sees exactly the imagery from the Scouring of the Shire. He sees Hobbiton destroyed, he sees the line of hobbits chained.
You see him see the sort of the Shire kind of become like a horrible, almost Holocaust factory kind of environment. So you have sort of a tip of the hat to it there. And then in this extended cut DVD of Return of the King, you also have it in that the way Saruman and Wormtongue interact together, the way he ultimately mistreats Wormtongue and then is stabbed and killed with the dagger, is essentially what does happen in the Scouring of the Shire. It's just been transplanted to atop Orthanc Tower.
I think the reason to lose the Scouring of the Shire to me was very straightforward. It was one of those no-brainers. You know, at the very beginning of this process, we'd identified the spine of our movies being Frodo taking the ring to Mordor, which means that the climax of our movies is Frodo destroying the ring. Now, we obviously have a denouement. In fact, the denouement of Return of the King is long and extensive, and it's 20 minutes, and which is 20 minutes that we wanted to spend covering the damage to Frodo as a result of this journey that he's had. To get to that point where the ring's destroyed and then to sort of deviate into a completely different event and storyline, to me, felt anticlimactic, I guess is what I'd describe it.
You can't start up the story again, not after nearly 9 hours of storytelling, which I know people are going to find ironic given the ending that is on this movie.
We actually reduced it down a lot to what it was. It was actually quite a lot longer at one stage. There were huge amounts of people we missed out. I mean, what happened to Gimli and what happened to Legolas. There were scenes shot of those people. We sort of tried to mould it together so it flowed reasonably well. But I can understand a lot of viewers did sort of find there's too many endings, and there's been a lot of discussion about that.
I was backstage at the Golden Globes, and Jack Nicholson's backstage, and he starts talking to me about Lord of the Rings. And he's like, "Did you die?" And I said, well, yeah. I mean, it sort of depends on how you look at it, with him going away to the Undying Lands at the end. And he's like, "What are you talking about? I left a half an hour before that." So I was like, "Well, wait, you didn't see the end of the film? You didn't even see the ends. You didn't even see, like, you know, Frodo and getting on the boat." He's like, "Oh no, too many endings, man. Should have ended it a lot sooner than that." He thought there were too many endings. So he went out to get the car and get the car warm for his family.
But quite honestly, I've never quite seen it as multiple endings. I think, you know, it is to some degree in the sense that you have to pay off Aragorn and Arwen. But to me, that is the only other ending. And so whilst it's vital for Aragorn to have that climax and to bring him and Arwen together, because God knows we'd spent so much of these movies having Aragorn and Arwen apart, the sort of the tension of what's going to happen to them, where you have to resolve that. But we were certainly never intending to end the film at that particular point, because that's not what our story is about. Our story is about Frodo. It was never Aragorn's story. We wanted to end with the fate of Frodo, if you like, experiencing what life is like through his eyes on his return home, to the point that he can no longer stay there.
How do you go on when in your heart you begin to understand there is no going back?
I think the true climax of the movie is the passing of Frodo from this world, whether you perceive that as a metaphor for death or whatever you want to call it. It was for me.
We wanted to do exactly the same ending as in the book, and we wanted the last line of the film to be the last line of the book. I mean, that was very important to us, where Sam says,
"Well, I'm back."
Which is basically saying it's over. It's time to get on with our lives. Whatever is in front of us, this is the beginning of a new life, you know.
The reason Fran and Philippa and Peter are worthy of the Best Adapted Screenplay Oscar that they won is because they were tireless and merciless with themselves.
You never just say this is perfect. You know, you're always fighting and grappling with yourself to try to push it further and further and take every opportunity you can.
It's hard to imagine anybody else being able to pull that many elements from the book, from the appendix, from the Silmarillion, from the Hobbit, and also being open to contributions from different people.
And now we have two roads to Middle-earth, two roads into the map. Tolkien himself and Tolkien as interpreted by Jackson.
You know, and I hope that what we've done is certainly in keeping with the spirit of Tolkien, and one of the dreams, I guess, is that if he was in a position to be able to see these films, that he would be happy with what we have added and what we've changed and what we've simplified. Well, he probably wouldn't be happy with what we've simplified, but I hope he would at least, you know, have some sense of delight in the fact that that this mythology that he set out to create is now taking on a life separate to him.